Shaq was quietly shopping in an upscale store when a cop sneered loudly, "Stick to basketball, big guy. Luxury ain't for you." Everyone froze. Customers gasped. Phones discreetly recorded. But Shaq didn't get angry. He just smiled. Because what he did next wouldn't just teach one arrogant officer a lesson, it would spark a movement that changed everything. Stay till the end. This story will redefine justice. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Shaq casually thumbed through a rack of finely tailored suits, the soft fabric sliding effortlessly through his fingers. Sunlight streamed through polished windows, highlighting the pristine marble floors of the exclusive boutique. His towering presence drew a few curious glances, but Shaq paid no mind. This was his world, and luxury was nothing new. But before he could select another jacket, a sharp voice sliced through the quiet hum of soft jazz music. "Hey, big guy, this ain't Foot Locker. You lost?" Shaq slowly turned around, locking eyes with Officer Hayes, a muscular cop moonlighting as mall security. Hayes stood with his arms crossed over his barrel chest, a mocking grin plastered on his face. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be," Shaq replied, calm but firm. Hayes chuckled, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Oh, really? Pretending you can actually afford any of this stuff?" He raised his voice, theatrically gesturing around the boutique. "Come on, man, who you trying to fool?" The air grew thick. Customers halted mid-step, glancing nervously between Shaq and Hayes. A young woman subtly slid out her phone, angling it toward the confrontation. Another customer whispered to his partner, "Is that Shaq?" Ignoring the attention, Shaq maintained his composure. "You sure you want to do this, officer?" Hayes stepped closer, smirking confidently. "You celebrities think you can walk into any place and own it, but money can't buy respect, especially for someone like you." Shaq's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Respect goes both ways. You're about to find that out." Hayes let out a dismissive laugh, shaking his head dramatically. "Threatening an officer now? That's cute. Real cute." He glanced around at the growing crowd, enjoying the spotlight. "Tell you what, I'll give you a little advice. Go back to shooting hoops, big guy. Leave the shopping to people who actually belong here." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Phones discreetly filmed every word, every gesture. Shaq stood in silence, a storm brewing behind his composed expression. Without another word, Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His large fingers moved swiftly over the screen, typing a quick message to his lawyer. Officer Hayes squinted suspiciously. "What's that? Calling for backup?" Shaq ignored the bait. He calmly signaled to his assistant, who had been silently observing from near the doorway. The assistant hurried over, nervous but alert. "Yes, sir?" Shaq lowered his voice just enough for Hayes to hear. "Make a call. Let's buy the whole mall, right now." A stunned silence swept the boutique. Hayes's arrogant smirk faltered for the first time, his confidence visibly shaken. Customers exchanged wide-eyed glances, some barely suppressing smiles. "Wait, you're bluffing," Hayes stammered, uncertainty creeping into his voice. He searched Shaq's expression desperately for signs of a joke, but found none. Shaq met his gaze directly, utterly composed. "You had your chance, officer. You chose disrespect. Now I'll choose action." The silence hung thick in the air, punctuated only by the faint click of a recording phone. Officer Hayes stood frozen, suddenly realizing he'd just poked a bear far bigger than he'd ever imagined. Shaq's assistant nodded and immediately began dialing, and Hayes felt his stomach drop. He had mocked the wrong man, and the consequences were about to be devastating. Officer Hayes stood alone in the mall security office, sweat trickling down his neck as he stared at the screen of his phone in disbelief. Just minutes earlier, he'd felt untouchable. Now his heart pounded relentlessly as notifications poured in like an avalanche, flooding every inch of the screen. He tapped the latest notification, a viral video titled, "Cop Publicly Humiliates Shaq at Luxury Mall." His throat tightened. The footage was crystal clear, capturing every sarcastic jab and mocking laugh. Shaq's calm, dignified presence in the video only made Hayes look worse, like a bully abusing power. Hands shaking, he scrolled through the comments, each more condemning than the last. "This officer should be fired immediately. Absolutely disgusting behavior. Justice for Shaq. Who does this cop think he is messing with Shaq? Wrong move." Hayes slammed his phone down onto the desk, the room suddenly feeling suffocatingly small. Before he could process another thought, the office phone blared sharply, shattering the silence. "Officer Hayes," he answered nervously. "This is Deputy Chief Walker." A stern voice snapped through the line. "Have you lost your mind?" Hayes swallowed hard. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Security measures." "Your job?" Walker roared. "Your job is to protect and serve, not publicly humiliate an innocent man. Do you have any idea how badly you've damaged our department's reputation?" "But sir," No excuses. Walker cut him off coldly. You're relieved from duty pending further investigation. Don't even think about speaking to the press. The line went dead and Hayes slumped into his chair, gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. His mind raced frantically, struggling to piece together a plan. Any plan that could salvage his reputation. Meanwhile, across town, Shaq sat calmly in a sleek leather chair at his attorney's polished oak conference table. The city skyline glittered behind them through floor-to-ceiling windows. His lawyer, Marcus Donovan, a sharp-eyed man in an impeccable charcoal suit, leaned forward, spreading financial documents across the table. Shaq, Donovan said, barely containing his amazement. It's all confirmed. The mall owners accepted your offer instantly. You now officially own the entire complex. Shaq nodded, unfazed. Good. Make sure Hayes is banned immediately. This isn't about revenge. This is about making a statement. Donovan chuckled softly, shaking his head in admiration. You certainly know how to make waves. Shaq glanced at his phone. The video's views had surpassed 20 million in less than an hour, and national news alerts flashed non-stop across his screen. He allowed himself a brief, satisfied smile. But across the city, Officer Hayes paced restlessly, his anger boiling into a volatile rage. How had things spiraled so quickly? How could he lose everything over one confrontation? No! Hayes growled to himself, clenching his fists. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. He stormed out of the office, determination flaring dangerously in his eyes. He refused to let Shaq win, to let the world see him as weak. There had to be a way to fight back, a way to regain control. As he marched to his car, Hayes muttered through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. You're gonna pay for embarrassing me, Shaq. You haven't seen the last of me. Little did Shaq know, Officer Hayes wasn't about to quietly disappear. He was planning something far worse. The bright lights of news cameras flashed relentlessly as Shaq stood confidently at the mall's grand entrance, dressed impeccably in a custom-tailored navy suit. Behind him, an enormous banner stretched across the building's facade, boldly declaring, under new ownership. Reporters eagerly pushed forward, microphones extended, desperate to capture his every word. Shaq raised a hand, effortlessly commanding silence from the buzzing crowd. I didn't buy this mall for personal gain, he declared firmly, his deep voice echoing through the courtyard. I bought it as a stand against disrespect and discrimination. No person should ever feel unwelcome because of who they are. A wave of applause erupted spontaneously from the gathered employees and shoppers. Even seasoned reporters couldn't hide their admiration, nodding in approval as they rapidly scribbled notes. Inside the management office, Officer Hayes stared numbly at the television screen, his face pale with disbelief. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his trance. A young courier stepped inside, hesitantly handing him an envelope bearing Shaq's official emblem. What is this? Hayes snapped, tearing open the envelope. His eyes widened as he read the brief but devastating note inside. Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from all properties owned by O'Neill Enterprises. Hayes crumpled the paper in rage, throwing it violently across the room. His career teetered on the brink, and now even his pride was stripped away. Back outside, reporters pressed closer, shouting questions above each other. One voice rose louder than the others, slicing through the commotion. This is ridiculous, Hayes shouted, pushing through the crowd, eyes blazing with fury. You're just abusing your power, trying to embarrass me. The air froze. Cameras swiveled toward Hayes, capturing every second of his meltdown. Shaq turned slowly, unfazed, calmly meeting Hayes' fiery glare. No, Shaq replied firmly, shaking his head slightly. You embarrassed yourself. I simply refused to stand by and watch it happen. Employees exchanged nervous glances, unsure how the scene would unfold. Hayes stepped closer, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. You think you can use your money to intimidate people? Destroy lives? Shaq raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. No, Officer Hayes. Money doesn't intimidate people. Actions do. Your actions spoke volumes, and now you're facing the consequences. Hayes hesitated. Realism. Shaq had backed him into a corner. Every camera was trained on him, awaiting his next words. Humiliation burned his face, turning his rage into quiet desperation. This isn't over, Hayes muttered weakly, his voice barely audible. Shaq tilted his head, calmly holding Hayes' stare, his voice soft yet chillingly powerful. You're right, officer. This isn't over. The crowd gasped quietly, sensing the electric tension hanging between the two men. Shaq paused deliberately, letting his words sink in before continuing. This, Shaq declared confidently, is just the beginning. Hayes felt a chill race down his spine, knowing Shaq's words meant the worst was yet to come. Officer Hayes paced his dimly lit apartment, the television glowing harshly in the background. Shaq's confident face stared back at him, replaying that humiliating public encounter again and again. Anger boiled inside Hayes until he finally snapped, grabbing his phone and dialing a reporter's number he'd saved for a rainy day. "I've got something big on Shaquille O'Neal," he growled, pacing rapidly. "Meet me at the coffee shop downtown. 20 minutes. A short while later, Hayes sat anxiously in a secluded booth, his knuckles white as he gripped the ceramic mug in front of him. Reporter Cynthia Walsh slid into the seat opposite him, notebook open, pen poised. "Talk," she said bluntly, eyes narrowed skeptically. "Make it worth my while." Hayes leaned in close, voice lowered conspiratorially. "Shaq's mall purchase. It's fraud. There's no way he pulled off a legitimate deal that fast. Someone needs to look into where that money came from." Cynthia raised an eyebrow, scribbling rapidly. "Serious accusations, officer. Do you have proof?" Hayes hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding firmly. "Absolutely. Trust me. Just run the story." The next morning, headlines exploded across the city. Officer accuses Shaq of fraudulent mall purchase. Social media erupted, speculation flooding timeline. Cameras crowded around Shaq as he calmly exited his car outside the mall. Reporters shouted accusations, their voices overlapping chaotically. "Shaq, is it true you committed fraud? Did you illegally fund the mall purchase?" Shaq raised his hands gently, silencing the crowd. His eyes were steady, unwavering as he responded, voice confident and measured. "My transactions are an open book. I have nothing to hide. But Officer Hayes, maybe he's the one who needs investigating." Cameras flashed wildly as Shaq's lawyer stepped forward, calmly presenting documents that immediately silenced any doubts. Bank statements, financial clearances, and even public records laid bare Shaq's perfectly legitimate purchase, leaving no room for question. Embarrassment swept through the reporters. Cynthia Walsh glanced nervously at Hayes, who stood frozen nearby, his face draining of color as the crowd turned their eyes accusingly toward him. "Seems the only fraud here," Shaq announced clearly, "is the one accusing me." Public sentiment shifted instantly. Online threads exploded, lambasting Hayes for his baseless claims and praising Shaq for transparency and integrity. Hayes' phone buzzed relentlessly with angry texts from former allies and colleagues, condemning him for damaging their collective reputation. Isolated, Hayes returned to his empty apartment, slamming the door shut and sliding to the floor, defeated. His reputation was unraveling faster than he could control. Suddenly, the TV interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Breaking news. Officer Hayes faces investigation into misconduct allegation. Hayes' heart plummeted, eyes wide in disbelief as Shaq appeared on screen, standing solemnly before a wall of microphone. "After recent events," Shaq declared, his voice strong and clear, "it became apparent that Officer Hayes has a troubling history that warrants deeper investigation. Harassment, racial profiling. Multiple victims have stepped forward, and it's time for accountability." The room spun around Hayes as his mind desperately searched for an escape. But it was too late. Shaq's calm determination had exposed Hayes completely. Panic rising, Hayes knew his days in uniform were numbered. Shaq looked directly into the camera, voice unwavering as he revealed, "And tomorrow the world will learn exactly who Officer Hayes really is. And believe me, it's far worse than you imagine." Officer Hayes watched helplessly as his darkest secrets flooded every news outlet in the city. His television displayed a montage of faces, men and women he'd stopped, humiliated, and harassed, all speaking boldly about their encounters. The headline flashed, "Officer Hayes exposed. Multiple victims of racial harassment step forward." His phone buzzed incessantly. Each message, angrier than the last, burned into his consciousness like hot coals. Hayes gripped the device so tightly that his knuckles turned white, trembling with fury. Meanwhile, Shaq sat across from a young woman named Tasha in a cozy cafe. Her hands trembled as she clutched her coffee, eyes glistening with tears. "He pulled me over for nothing," she whispered, voice shaking. "He humiliated me, accused me of stealing my own car. I was terrified." Shaq listened quietly, eyes filled with genuine empathy. He gently placed a comforting hand on hers. "Tasha, I promise you, justice is coming. You're not alone." Her story echoed many others. Every victim Shaq met shared hauntingly similar experiences. The weight of their collective pain fueled his resolve. He knew confronting injustice required strength, and he had plenty to spare. Back at police headquarters, Chief Bennett called Hayes into his office. Hayes entered, head high, trying to mask his panic with defiance. "Sit down," the chief ordered coldly, his voice sharp as ice. "What's this about?" Hayes snapped, feigning ignorance. Bennett's eyes narrowed, tossing a thick folder onto his desk. "Multiple harassment cases, Witness statements, video evidence. You thought you could keep this hidden? Hayes shifted uncomfortably, attempting a laugh. You're really buying into this witch hunt? Enough, Bennett interrupted harshly. Effective immediately, you're suspended. Internal Affairs will handle the investigation. Hand over your badge and weapon. Hayes stood frozen, heart pounding violently in his chest. His badge was his shield, his power. Without it, he was nothing. Slowly, painfully, he surrendered his badge, slamming it bitterly onto the desk. Outside the station, reporters swarmed, flashing cameras capturing his humiliation. He shoved through angrily, desperately trying to discredit the growing accusation. They're lying. Shaq's paying them all off, he shouted desperately, but no one listened. He was drowning, and every desperate claim dragged him further beneath the waves. At home, consumed by rage, Hayes hurled his phone across the room, shattering it. The walls seemed to close in as darkness engulfed him, his breathing heavy, ragged with fury. He stared at the television, Shaq's face again dominating the screen, calm, respected, victorious. Hayes's vision blurred, his fury rising uncontrollably. They ruined my life, he muttered dangerously, voice shaking. Shaq thinks he's untouchable. Let's see about that. With eyes blazing and hands trembling with rage, Hayes grabbed his keys. His mind was clear now, dangerously clear. If Shaq thought he'd won, he was gravely mistaken. Hayes stormed out the door, his expression cold and determined. He was going to confront Shaq face to face, and this time, there would be no cameras, no witnesses, only revenge. Shaq stepped out into the cool night air, laughter spilling from the brightly lit restaurant behind him. Cameras flashed as eager fans spotted him, asking for selfie. He smiled warmly, obliging as always. The evening felt perfect, until a dark silhouette emerged suddenly from the shadow. Think you're untouchable, don't you? Hissed a familiar voice. Shaq's expression hardened immediately. Officer Hayes stood barely 10 feet away, his face distorted with anger, his hands clenched at his sides. The crowd quieted instantly, sensing the tension. Phones quickly lifted, recording the unexpected confrontation. Hayes, Shaq said calmly, his voice firm but controlled. This isn't the way. Walk away. But Hayes didn't move. His breathing was erratic, his eyes wild with a dangerous, desperate fury. You destroyed me, Hayes spat venomously. Now it's your turn. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Shaq remained perfectly still, his stance authoritative yet reassuring. His voice was steady, clearly audible. You destroyed yourself, Hayes. Actions have consequences. Without warning, Hayes lunged forward, closing the gap rapidly. The crowd screamed, scattering frantically. Hayes reached into his jacket pocket, and the glint of metal flashed beneath the streetlights. The moment hung suspended, terrifying and surreal. Instantly, Shaq's personal security leaped into action, intercepting Hayes just before he reached Shaq. Chaos erupted as Hayes fought desperately, his anger fueling unnatural strength. Let me go, he bellowed, thrashing violently against the guards holding him back. This isn't over. Shaq watched silently, sadness and disappointment evident on his face. Police sirens wailed nearby, lights flashing, slicing through the darkness. Officers burst from their cars, swiftly restraining Hayes, who still shouted incoherently. You're arresting me? Hayes screamed in disbelief as cuffs clicked around his wrists. He's the real criminal. He destroyed my life. As Hayes was forced roughly into the back of a police car, Shaq turned to the stunned crowd and raised his hands calmly, signaling quiet. This, Shaq said clearly, gesturing toward the police cruiser, is what happens when hatred goes unchecked. Officer Hayes had every chance to learn, to change, to be better. But systemic racism corrupts minds, breeds anger, and ultimately, violence. The crowd murmured solemnly, deeply moved by Shaq's words. Cameras captured every second, live streaming the raw, emotional moment worldwide. But we, Shaq continued passionately, have the power to stop it. This is our moment, right now. We must come together and break the cycle. A wave of applause and supportive cheers rose spontaneously, echoing into the night. Shaq nodded appreciatively, though his expression remained serious, determined. Turning slightly, his assistant leaned in and whispered discreetly, "The mayor just called. He's asking how you want to respond publicly." Shaq nodded thoughtfully. He knew his next move had to be bold, decisive, groundbreaking. The incident tonight could be a catalyst, a turning point in the fight for justice. Facing the cameras once more, Shaq spoke firmly, addressing the world watching closely. Tonight has proven we need more than words. It's time for action. Tomorrow morning, I will hold a press conference outlining a revolutionary plan, one designed not just to punish, but to fundamentally change our justice system. Excited whispers spread instantly. Journalists scrambled to report the breaking news, speculating on what Shaq's announcement might entail. Shaq paused, letting his words resonate, feeling the weight of history on his shoulders. Officer Hayes will be held accountable, he declared finally, but our ultimate goal is deeper. We will heal this nation from the inside out. Shaq's gaze swept across the crowd, confident and unwavering. Stay tuned, he announced clearly. Tomorrow we change everything. Camera shutters clicked rapidly, filling the crowded City Hall auditorium as reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting in anticipation. Shaq stepped confidently onto the stage, his expression calm but resolute. A hushed silence fell over the room immediately. Last night, Shaq began, his deep voice resonating through the microphone. We witnessed the ugly consequences of unchecked hatred, but today we're not here to dwell on negativity. We're here for change. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd as he paused for effect. Shaq glanced briefly down at his notes, then lifted his gaze to address the room directly. Words alone are empty if not followed by action. Today I'm putting my money, my reputation, and my heart behind true, lasting reform. Excitement buzzed through the audience, journalists frantically taking notes and exchanging eager glances. I'm officially pledging $50 million, Shaq announced firmly, to fund comprehensive anti-racism and bias training programs for every single officer in this city. Gasps and spontaneous applause erupted immediately. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, while cameras captured Shaq's determined, unwavering gaze. Across town, Officer Hayes watched the live broadcast from his tiny, cluttered apartment. Beer bottles littered the table, blinds drawn against the harsh reality outside. Anger boiled within him as Shaq's words echoed mockingly television. $50 million? Hayes snarled bitterly, throwing an empty bottle violently across the room. It shattered loudly, glass shards scattering. He's ruining me, and now he's being celebrated like some hero? Back at the podium, Shaq continued passionately, we must hold our police accountable, not just individually but institutionally. Every citizen deserves to feel safe, protected, and respected by those who swear to serve them. He leaned closer, eyes intense with sincerity. Today is just the start. This city will set an example that the entire nation can follow. I promise you, we will lead this fight until real justice and equality become reality for everyone. The crowd burst into deafening applause, cheers erupting spontaneously. Reporters shouted eager questions as Shaq stepped back from the podium, but he paused once more, raising his hand for silence. One last thing, he said, his voice filled with conviction. Officer Hayes' actions do not represent every officer, but they do represent a sickness we cannot ignore. I'm proud to announce that the City Police Department has officially terminated Officer Hayes, effective immediately. Hayes stared blankly at the television, his face drained of color, heart sinking. He knew it was coming, but hearing it announced publicly, so coldly and definitively, was a crushing blow. Shaq concluded, while justice has prevailed today, our work is not done. Stay tuned, because this movement has only just begun. Cameras flashed relentlessly as Shaq left the stage, his head held high amid a sea of enthusiastic applause. Outside City Hall, chants of Shaq's name echoed loudly through the streets. He had not only taken down a symbol of injustice, he had become a beacon of hope. In his apartment, Hayes slumped deeper into despair, bitterness tightening around his chest. He had lost everything: his badge, his pride, his purpose. Shaq's actions left him isolated, unemployed, and despised. The cheers and applause from the television mocked him relentlessly. Suddenly, the crowd quieted as Shaq reappeared briefly on screen. Hayes leaned forward despite himself, compelled to listen. This, Shaq declared firmly, is just the beginning. Tomorrow I have another announcement, one that will reshape this city in ways no one can imagine. Hayes' breath quickened, his fists clenched. Fear mingled with anger, twisting painfully in his gut. Just how far would Shaq go? How much further could he fall? Shaq's image filled the screen, confidence radiating from him. Believe me, he promised, a determined glint in his eyes. The best and biggest is yet to come. The enormous banner cascaded down dramatically, revealing the bold letters, Unity Plaza, in striking, vibrant colors. Cameras flashed furiously, capturing the historic moment. Shaq stood center stage, a proud smile illuminating his face as cheers erupted from the massive crowd. Today, we reclaim this space, Shaq announced, his deep voice powerful and clear. No longer is this just a shopping mall. It's now a living, breathing symbol of inclusion, diversity, and unity. Crowds of people, young, old, diverse in background, applauded wildly, inspired by Shaq's words. Rows of previously empty storefronts were now filled with brightly decorated windows, showcasing minority-owned businesses. Their owners stood proudly by, gratitude etched into every hopeful face. Shaq gestured warmly toward the entrepreneurs behind him. These are our community leaders, our innovators. They deserve our respect, support, and recognition. Unity Plaza will uplift voices that have been silenced for too long. At home, Hayes watched the live broadcast, bitterness twisting in his stomach. He slumped deeper into his frayed recliner, the remote clutched tightly, knuckles white. Every applause, every cheer stabbed at him like needles. Once proud and powerful, he now felt completely powerless. The camera zoomed in on Shaq as he took a step forward, seriousness shading his expression. I'm also proud to announce today the launch of the Unity Scholarship Fund, a chance for local minority youth to fulfill their dreams. The crowd erupted again, louder this time. Hayes ground his teeth, fury bubbling within him. This isn't right, he muttered bitterly. He ruined my life, and now he gets celebrated. On screen, a reporter eagerly approached Shaq. Shaq, what's your message to those who doubted you could turn this mall into something meaningful? Shaq leaned into the mic, his voice steady, resolute. Real change doesn't come from division. It comes from understanding. Unity Plaza is proof we can create a better future together. Cheers exploded again. Hayes couldn't bear another second. He hurled the remote across the room, shattering it against the wall. Breathing heavily, he stared at his shaking hands, desperation clouding his judgment. A twisted determination sparked in his eyes. There had to be a way to regain control, to undo some of the damage. Quickly, impulsively, Hayes grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he opened his social media account. He hesitated, staring at the screen. Could one apology possibly save him from this ruin? The thought lingered, desperation overtaking reason. Swallowing his pride, he started recording. My name is former Officer Hayes, he began shakily, voice breaking. I owe Shaq, and all of you, a public apology. His voice trembled as he continued. And there's something else you all need to know. Officer Hayes's face filled every screen in town. His once arrogant eyes now reflected vulnerability. Sweat glistened on his forehead under the glaring lights. His voice, strained and shaky, echoed painfully through countless living rooms. I made a grave mistake, Hayes stammered, his voice thin and hollow. I unfairly targeted Shaq, and I know now how deeply wrong I was. Social media exploded instantly, comments flooding the live stream. Too little. Too late. Fake apology. Hayes is only sorry he got caught. At Unity Plaza, Shaq stood quietly, eyes fixed on his phone, watching the apology unfold. Around him, crowds murmured skeptically. Journalists pressed close, microphones extended, eager for a reaction. Shaq, what's your response? Do you accept his apology? Shaq calmly raised his eyes, a quiet strength radiating from him. An apology doesn't erase the harm caused. Real accountability means more than words. Reporters nodded quickly, capturing every word. Does this mean you reject Hayes' apology entirely? Shaq shook his head thoughtfully. I'm not the one who needs that apology. He owes it to every person he disrespected and hurt throughout his career. At his apartment, Hayes watched Shaq's response, heart sinking. Panic surged through him as he scrolled through hundreds of comments, each harsher than the last. You can't fix years of racism with one weak apology. Hayes deserves everything coming to him. Hayes' phone buzzed sharply, a familiar number, his former partner. Relief flooded his chest as he answered desperately. Mike, thank God. I thought you don't. Mike cut him off coldly. You brought this on yourself, man. I can't help you anymore. The line went dead. Hayes stared at the silent phone, feeling utterly abandoned. Outside his window, rain began hammering down, mirroring the storm inside him. He'd counted on loyalty, on someone, anyone to stand by him, but now he was utterly alone. He paced desperately around the room, running his fingers through disheveled hair. His badge, tarnished and meaningless, lay discarded on the coffee table beside a stack of unpaid bills. Photos of his graduation from the police academy mocked him from the shelf, reminders of the respect he'd destroyed. No, he whispered, shaking uncontrollably. This can't be it. Not like this. He moved toward the window, pulling aside the curtain. Outside, life continued without him. People hurried by under umbrellas, oblivious to his pain. He was invisible, discarded. His breathing quickened, panic giving way to hopelessness. A lump formed in his throat, vision blurring with tears he fought desperately to suppress. Sinking to the floor, he finally allowed himself to break, letting years of bitterness, regret, and isolation pour out in uncontrollable sobs. I did this, Hayes whispered to himself, voice trembling with self-loathing. I destroyed my own life. The sound of frantic knocking at his door jolted him upright. Who could possibly be coming for him now? The frantic knocking echoed urgently through Hayes' tiny apartment, snapping him out of his despair. Slowly he stood up, heart pounding, breath caught in his chest. As he approached, the knocking intensified. All right, Hayes shouted, voice cracking with nerves. He swung the door open and froze. Towering in the dim hallway was Shaq, his large frame nearly filling the doorway. Rainwater dripped steadily off his broad shoulders, forming tiny puddles on the floor. Hayes stumbled backward, eyes wide. "Shaq, what are you doing here?" Shaq took a calm step inside, glancing around at the disheveled apartment. Empty pizza boxes, bills scattered carelessly. Without judgment, he met Hayes's fearful eyes. "We need to talk." Hayes swallowed hard, uncertainty choking him. "Listen, man, I already apologized. They hate me. I lost everything. Isn't that enough?" "No," Shaq replied firmly, his deep voice filling the room with authority. "An apology isn't the end. It's the beginning." Hayes shook his head weakly, confusion etched on his pale face. "What do you mean?" Shaq moved toward the window, looking out thoughtfully. The rain tapped rhythmically on the glass. "You can't erase what you did, but maybe, just maybe, you can help others avoid your mistakes." Hayes frowned, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Why would you, of all people, help me?" Shaq turned slowly, locking eyes with Hayes, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Because real change comes from facing the truth, even when it's ugly. Especially then." Hayes stood frozen, heart thundering in his ears. After a tense silence, he finally whispered, "What would I have to do?" "Face the public again," Shaq explained calmly. "Tell your story. Admit your mistakes openly. No excuses. Help people understand what racism really looks like and what it can cost." Hayes trembled, his chest tightening in fear. "They'll tear me apart." "They already did," Shaq reminded him quietly. "But this time, you'll be speaking the truth, not just giving an empty apology. That matters." For the first time, Hayes saw genuine empathy in Shaq's eyes. It felt alien, undeserved. Tears welled again, but he blinked them away quickly, ashamed. "You really think this can make a difference?" Shaq nodded once, certain. "More than you realize." Hayes took a deep, shaky breath, his hands trembling visibly. After a moment, he finally nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Days later, media swarmed outside Unity Plaza, cameras rolling as crowds buzzed with anticipation. No one expected what came next. Shaq stepped onto the stage, his towering presence commanding instant silence. "Today isn't just about forgiveness," Shaq began calmly, his voice carrying effortlessly. "It's about courage. The courage to admit our failure. The courage to change." Murmurs swept through the audience, confusion mounting. Shaq looked off stage, gesturing firmly. "Please welcome Officer Hayes." Shock rippled through the crowd as Hayes walked hesitantly onto the stage, visibly shaken, yet determined. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the historic moment. Hayes cleared his throat nervously, voice trembling as he spoke. "I've made horrible mistakes," Hayes confessed openly. "My arrogance and prejudice hurt many people, especially Shaq. I'm not here expecting forgiveness. I'm here to own my actions and hopefully to help prevent others from repeating them." The silence was deafening. Then slowly, applause began. A ripple at first, then building into a powerful wave of support. Tears spilled freely down Hayes' cheeks, relief flooding his body. Shaq stepped forward, placing a supportive hand firmly on Hayes' shoulder. Flash bulbs exploded around them, capturing the profound, unexpected unity of victim and aggressor standing together. Among the reporters, one shouted urgently, "Shaq, is this the end? Or just the beginning?" Shaq's eyes glistened as he leaned into the microphone, delivering words that would shock everyone. Officer Hayes stood before an audience packed into Unity Plaza, cameras focused intensely, capturing his every emotion. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but determination radiated from his stance as he prepared to speak openly about his shameful past. "I spent my whole career believing I was untouchable," Hayes began, his voice steady, yet filled with sincere regret. "But all it took was one moment, one cruel mistake, to shatter that illusion. The person who taught me humility and accountability wasn't someone I admired. It was someone I wronged." The crowd remained silent, hanging on to his every word. Hayes briefly looked behind him, where Shaq stood, offering quiet strength. He drew courage from that presence and continued. "Shaq showed me something greater than punishment. He showed me what true leadership looks like: compassion, courage, and forgiveness. Today, I dedicate my life to making sure others never repeat my mistakes." Hayes' heartfelt words spread rapidly across the internet, igniting an overwhelming wave of support and admiration. Millions viewed his confession, sharing it as an example of true accountability. The city's residents, moved by this powerful story of redemption, began demanding broader changes in law enforcement. Meanwhile, Shaq watched calmly from the side, a subtle smile on his lips. He knew he'd made a gamble offering Hayes redemption, but the sincerity in Hayes' voice proved he'd made the right choice. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about confronting deep-rooted prejudices and breaking them down piece by piece. Days later, City Hall was alive with excitement. Reporters scrambled for positions, their microphones poised as Shaq approached the podium, Mayor Richardson standing proudly beside him. "Today, our city celebrates a remarkable transformation," Mayor Richardson declared, voice filled with pride. "We honor a man who chose unity over division, forgiveness over revenge. Shaquille O'Neal isn't just a celebrity, he's a true hero." The audience erupted into thunderous applause as Shaq graciously accepted the city's highest honor, holding up a gleaming golden key. Yet as cheers echoed through the room, Shaq raised his hand, calling for silence. "Thank you," he said, his deep voice resonating throughout the hall. "But this isn't just my story. It's our story. We still have much work to do." Officer Hayes proved that change is possible. "Now I have one more announcement." A hush fell over the crowd. Shaq's eyes sparkled mysteriously as he leaned into the microphone, revealing something no one expected. "My friends," he announced with unwavering resolve, "this is only the beginning. I'm launching one final initiative, and trust me, it's going to change everything." Shaq stood before an enormous crowd, his towering presence filling the stage as thousands of people packed the grand auditorium. Bright camera flashes flickered from every direction, illuminating his calm, confident expression. The air crackled with anticipation as the audience waited for Shaq's groundbreaking announcement, his final bold initiative to combat racism and discrimination nationwide. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shaq began, his powerful voice echoing through the hall, "change isn't about punishing those who wrong us. It's about educating them, inspiring them, and building a future where mistakes of the past never repeat." He paused, scanning the audience. Every eye was locked on him, captivated by his unwavering resolve. "That's why today we're launching Unity Rising, the largest, most comprehensive anti-discrimination education program this country has ever seen." Gasps of excitement rippled through the audience, followed by an eruption of applause. Shaq nodded humbly, allowing the cheers to wash over him before continuing. "Unity Rising won't just talk about change, it will actively create it. Schools, colleges, police departments, corporations, every institution will have access to resources designed to promote understanding, empathy, and true unity." Behind Shaq, former Officer Hayes stepped hesitantly onto the stage, his eyes uncertain yet determined. The applause faltered momentarily as the crowd registered who it was. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on Hayes' shoulder, signaling trust and forgiveness. "Some might wonder why Officer Hayes is here today," Shaq acknowledged openly, his voice gentle but firm. "His journey taught us something vital, that redemption is always possible. We need people who've stumbled to help prevent others from falling." Hayes approached the microphone cautiously, his voice initially shaky. "I never imagined I'd be here. My mistakes nearly destroyed lives, including my own. But Shaq taught me something I never learned as a cop. Real strength is acknowledging when you're wrong and then choosing to do better." His vulnerability was palpable, and the audience responded with unexpected warmth. Cameras captured emotional reactions across the crowd, some wiping away tears, others applauding passionately. Hayes gained strength from their support and continued boldly. "I'll dedicate the rest of my life sharing this message. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary, and it starts right here, right now." As Hayes stepped back, Shaq again took center stage, visibly moved by the sincerity of Hayes' words. The atmosphere had transformed. Unity and forgiveness filled the room, creating a powerful sense of collective hope. Shaq raised his voice passionately, delivering his closing statement with unwavering conviction. "Today we stand together, not as individuals defined by our past, but as people committed to shaping our future. Racism, discrimination, prejudice, they have no place in the world we're building." The crowd rose in a spontaneous, unified standing ovation, the sound echoing through the auditorium, resonating far beyond its walls. Cameras continued to broadcast the historic moment to millions around the globe, spreading Shaq's powerful message of unity and reconciliation worldwide. Amid the roaring applause, Shaq's voice boomed one final, unforgettable declaration. "Real strength is in unity. Everyone deserves respect. Let's build a better future." His words reverberated across news stations, social media platforms, and households everywhere, igniting conversation, transforming hearts, and setting a new standard for justice and equality. But as Shaq stepped off stage, his assistant handed him an urgent note, whispering anxiously. Shaq's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, reading quickly. "Absolutely," the assistant replied nervously. Shaq folded the note carefully, eyes sharpening with determination. "Looks like our work isn't over yet.